Dear viewer, I've recently been introduced to the idea of patterning existing garments for reconstruction, and since I'm conveniently in possession of this antique mantle, what better opportunity to put this theory into practice? After consulting photographs and fashion plates, I've determined that the mantle probably dates to between 1895 and 1905. The fabric is very brittle and has rotted in places, but this is actually to the pattern taker's benefit since it allows you to peek inside and examine the guts of construction. Carefully measuring each piece, I transfer the points to a large sheet of grid paper, connecting the points to form the shape of the pattern pieces. I'm also noting which direction the pieces were cut along the grain, the amount of seam allowance, construction techniques, types of thread and fabric used, and how all of the ribbons and bows were assembled. Basically taking note of every smallest detail I can set my eyes on. The hem, it turns out, is surprisingly wonky, especially around the area that falls on the bias. It took all my willpower not to correct it, and if you're patterning with the intent of recreating the garment for daily wear, you might wish to. But since I'm doing this project as an experiment in reconstruction, I'm going to keep it as it is. It isn't noticeably distracting on the original mantle, so hopefully my reconstruction will also turn out okay. I've traced the pattern onto some newsprint to use for cutting out the pieces. The original mantle is made from a lightweight black silk with a satin woven geometric pattern, and needless to say, I didn't find anything remotely close to this in the garment district. I ended up going with this black Chinese brocade, which I'm still having a slight internal debate over. I don't think the pattern is quite right, and it's got much more of a sheen than I would have hoped, especially inappropriate if the original mantle was intended as a mourning garment. But it's a silk that was in my budget, and the weight is very similar to the original fabric, so at least it should make up nicely. For the lining I picked up a fine black wool, which is what I believe the original lining is. Mine doesn't have the interesting geometric pattern woven into it, but it does have a fancy herringbone stripe, so to each her own, I suppose. When examining the original garment, I noticed lots of tiny scraps of thread wedged into the seams. I assumed this meant that the pattern pieces were thread marked onto the fabric, but as I began to realize what an extraordinarily long time this was taking, I wondered if that was the most logical method to use. I went back and consulted several contemporary sewing manuals, and sure enough, all of them advised to mark out with tailor's chalk before cutting. One of them, Practical Dressmaking, advises to tack over chalk lines, so perhaps this is what was done on my example. Or the seams were tacked together before stitching by machine. It's possible that, since I only consulted a handful of the probable hundreds of sewing instruction texts of the period, there are in fact methods that advise thread marking, and I just haven't found it in my research. Being that the mantle is made of black silk, it might not have been desirable to mark with chalk. In any case, the pieces did look rather pleasing when stitched onto the fabric. And now everything is cut out. I should note that I've kept the selvages on where I could see them in the original pieces, though my selvages are a very ugly modern white. I'm still debating whether or not I should part from strict original practice for a moment to dye them black, but I shall get back to you on that. Before going any further, I'm first laying things out to make sure all the shapes match up and my pattern is relatively functional. Remember my earlier debate on whether or not to correct the bias on the outer hem? Unless I've wildly mismeasured, this is something that must have happened sometime during the past century after it was made, since the fabric and the lining pieces don't match up with the hems at all. After pinning one on top of the other in their proper positions, I remarked the hem of the outer fabric where it should fall compared with the lining, and when I trimmed it away, all the wonky bias shape was completely resolved. Hopefully this was the right thing to do, but we shall see how everything hangs when the garment is finished. Now that I know things will at least vaguely fit together, it's time to get into some sewing. By looking at the original garment, I could gather a rough sense of the construction sequence based on which pieces overlap others. I'm starting with the basics, and I'm just going to go ahead and get the center back seams stitched together. That is, the center back of the mantle, the yoke pieces, and the lining of the pleated panel, which is in two halves. I'm also taking this moment to pin together the two layers of the collar piece, which will be stitched together at the top and sides. These seams were all assembled by machine, and since historically authentic technique is my jam, I thought I'd explore some late 19th century machinery. A quick trawl through the wonders of eBay turned up this beauty, a hand-turned Singer manufactured in 1891 for something ridiculous like $40. They're surprisingly common and can be quite cheap if you're willing to do some repairs. She isn't nearly in perfect condition, but she functions well enough, so I'm looking forward to having a bit of proper bonding time. Since the original garment was made with 2-ply S-twist silk thread, I'm also using silk. However, the thread that I was able to purchase in the garment district is a modern 3-ply Z-twist, so I've made a note to order online in advance for my future historical silk thread needs. Once all my center back seams have been put together, I'm going to get started on the pleated panel in the back. The fabric and lining pieces on the original fold together perfectly, which makes me think that perhaps they were pleated together as one piece, so this is what I'm going to attempt. The pleats are in place, so now it's time to attach the panel to the body of the mantle. This is done with both right sides facing each other, but only the fabric side of the panel is stitched down by machine. The lining layer is left loose to be slip-stitched over the seam allowance later to hide the raw edges. I'm now finishing the raw edges by turning the lining edge and slip-stitching it over the seam allowance of the mantle edge. It's stitched just before the line of machine stitching, which is how I was able to tell that the bobbin was threaded in brown. As you may guess, the stitch line on the other side is black on top. And here is the pleated panel. I'm not quite content with the little gaps either side of the box pleat. They aren't there on the original, but no amount of shifting, pulling, or rearranging would fix it without warping the upper back of the mantle. I suspect this is a patterning issue to do with the angle at the back of the mantle pieces. Though it isn't how the original garment looks, it doesn't cause any major structural issues, so I'm just going to go ahead and not recut the whole thing. So I've gone ahead and pressed under the seam allowance for the yoke pieces. After I've basted it down into place, the bottom edges will get top stitched. Both bobbin and thread for this are black. Curiously, this step did definitely come after the pleating seams were stitched, since the top stitching runs through that panel. Then the collar stitching is later changed back to the black and brown, so either the original maker was working on multiple projects at once and changing out the bobbins between stages, but not rethreading, or possibly more than one machine was used. The raw edge at the top of the pleating panel was finished off with a 5/8 of an inch strip of the lining material. It's running stitched down the bottom edge, then turned and felled on the sides and top. Strangely, the left-hand side was felled in black silk thread, but the right switches to brown. So in the spirit of reconstruction, that's what I've done too. Finally, the pleats are quickly tacked into place 4 inches from the hem with some brown thread. I've gone ahead and stitched the facing pieces to the mantle, then pressed them back to conceal the center front raw edges. This piece now gets felled down to the lining. As you might notice, I've decided to tint the selvages black with a bit of ink. There's probably nothing historical about this, but the bright white selvages were just assaulting to the eye, and I have the feeling that, if this were the case in 1905, the maker would have just cut them off. Next, I'm attaching the collar, which is put on right sides together, turned, and then top stitched to finish the edge. Also, our brown bobbin friend is back. Now that the edges and collar are finished off, I'm taking a moment to attach the hooks and eyes at center front. One pair is placed at the base of the collar, and another smaller pair lives 4 inches down. I'm now putting in the hem all around the bottom edge of the mantle. It's done with a quick felling stitch, or I suppose I should say hemming, since that's what my contemporary sources have been calling the felling stitch. So I suppose I'm now hemming the hem. So now that the base of the mantle is complete, it's time to do some ribbon work, because no 19th or early 20th century garment is complete without a bit of frill. This mantle gets some pleating at the neck, a band round the collar, and some half bows at center front, all of which are constructed, not actually knotted or tied. I included the construction of these bows in my pattern when examining the original garment, and have used my measurements to pin out the lengths and folds of each ribbon piece. Then they're given a quick press to keep the folds in place. The ruffles and bows are made from black silk satin ribbon, so that's what I'm using on my reconstruction. It's imperative to use natural silk, as synthetic satin ribbon is much stiffer and won't pleat in the same way as the softer silk. The width of my ribbon is slightly smaller than that on the original, but it was the matter of $4 a yard at M&J, or $45 a yard at the other fancy trimming stores that sell silk ribbon, only for the difference of 5 millimeters, so the choice was very simple. The knots on the center ribbon loops are stitched on, and the tails are decoratively frayed at the edge, so they're ready now to be attached. But first, the pleated frill is attached by top stitching it to the collar, oddly with the brown bobbin thread showing on the outside. After quickly tacking on the fun bits, the reconstruction is complete. I think I might have fooled myself earlier because the Chinese brocade is in fact slightly heavier than the original silk used. Nevertheless, it's made up quite nicely and was pleasant to work with, so I'm not complaining. Plus, it's got a really nice weight and I imagine it would be quite warm. I'm rather tempted to wear it out on a nice autumn day. What say you, dear reader? Until next time, Bernadette.